everybody, and welcome to another video. And today it is the 10th of November, and we have a lot of news to get into. I apologize for not uploading for the past 5 days, but I will be making up for that today with a very in-depth analysis of the situation in Kherson and what everything on the battlefield will be looking like moving forward, going into November and into the winter seasons. We have a lot to get into, and so I want to start by just giving some context for why we're even seeing this happen right now. I did change the map. You can see this is roughly what the map looks like right now. I might have to change it again later on as the day goes by, as Ukraine goes into a lot of these unoccupied territories, unoccupied villages right now. And so I also have to move a lot of the Russian units. All of these are Russian units. I got to move them back to their new positions. I don't know where those are yet, so I'm going to have to do a lot of research to find that out. But for now, this is the map. You can see the new tentative front line, although I'm sure it will change very quickly. It could take a few hours and everything will be different by then. But anyway, let's get into this. So I want to go back to June 2022. And that's when Surovikin was made the leader of the Kherson grouping. And so I want to give some context for how the map looked like at the time. At the time, the map was really like on the boundary of the Kherson regional border. The Russians were in control of a pretty good chunk of Mykolaiv in the southern part of it. And they also had some positions that were pretty close to Kryvyi. Of course, they got pushed back at some points, especially in March, April. They got pushed back a lot from the outskirts of Mykolaiv, and they also got pushed out of the outskirts from Kryvyi. But they still did have forward positions that could be used as a springboard to attack Mykolaiv and attack Kryvyi. And another thing that they wanted to do is advance along this river over here. You can see this river over here and reach Voznesensk, which is really a key hub that is connecting a lot of the Ukrainian roads. Not only that, but it has some key energy infrastructure, and it is a good way to begin an operation towards Odessa and some of these other important towns in the on the Black Sea, most notably towns like Ochakiv, which Russia was planning to take, but that never came into fruition. And now those chances are even less likely following the events of today. But anyway, due to all of these failures that occurred early on in the war that forced Russia to withdraw, Surovikin was put as the leader of the Kherson grouping because he has a lot of military experience. If I recall correctly, he is 55 years old and he has a lot of experience from the post-Soviet years, whether it be in Tajikistan or perhaps in Syria. He had a lot of experience there. He was a part of the coalition to destroy ISIS. I think he also fought in Chechnya in first and second Chechen wars, and so he does have a lot of experience. And he's considered one of the hardliners, and so he was probably best fit for the job in order to hold the line. But the interesting thing is that he personally wanted the Russian forces in Kherson to move back. He didn't want them on this bridgehead anymore. And so there was really a big debate in Russia, in the Russian high command specifically, about what to do, whether to scale back, to withdraw across the river, abandon Kherson, set up new lines around the Dnieper River, or to hold the line for as long as possible, then waiting for reinforcements to be sent in, so then new attacks could be launched on Mykolaiv. And so for a while, the Russian strategy in here was very ambiguous, but we did see them basically just like try to hold the line, repel any sort of attempted breakthroughs by the Ukrainians. And so really this entire area was a war zone. And the Ukrainians, they talked for a very long time about a supposed counteroffensive. And so this was really hyped up in the summer. And of course, that did not happen in the summer, but something that was very important to the entire dynamic in this part of the front line was the HIMARS being sent in. And so those, they are very precision based missiles using GPS trackers. And so they're great for destroying whether it be sort of like logistics hubs or supply hubs, ammo caches, all those areas. They were heavily targeted by the Ukrainians starting in June, starting in July, August. And so that was a big problem for the Russian logistics. And so at that time, Surovikin was made the leader of the Kherson grouping. Exactly, it was on the 18th of June, 2022. And under his tenure, the Russian grouping here was able to achieve a lot of success. Basically, they were able to hold the line for months on end despite numerous Ukrainian attempted breakthroughs. Most notably, and I'm going to zoom in here, most notably, it was over here on this bridge over here, these two towns, Andrivka and Lozove. There were about 5 attempts that I can think of off the top of my head of Ukraine trying to break through across the Inhulets River to this area. And each time it failed, each time the Russians were able to push them back. And so this is due to Surovikin's strategy. Although he personally disagreed with keeping the Russian forces dug and entrenched in their forward positions, he was able to carry out the orders that were coming in from Putin. Putin wanted to stay on this bridgehead, and so he followed the orders. And you didn't really see any changes for a while. And so this all changed at the end of the summer, going into September. We saw the actual beginning of the Kherson counteroffensive. And so we saw a lot of fighting in this bridgehead area. Finally, they were able to actually secure the bridgehead and expand it a little, which tied down a lot of Russian forces. And at the same time, the Ukrainians were conducting a lot of probing attacks, a lot of probing operations in the northern part of the oblast. So around Vysokopilia specifically, there were very heavy fights. Arkhangelsk, I remember that town. There was a lot of battles there too. And so you had a lot of these probing assaults trying to see how strong the Russian defenses were over here. And what they realized was that there was only like one or two Russian paratrooper units that were manning this entire line in the north over here. And so they took advantage of this. They were able to secure a very quick mechanized breakthrough. And from there, they were able to force the Russians into a total retreat before they could get routed and encircled. And so the new line was around Dudchani, and from Dudchani to the bridgehead in Andrivka Lozove. And so this connected the grouping in northern Kherson, which had been fighting for so long and had really been in an attritional battle, suffered a lot of casualties in the process, but nonetheless they were able to achieve success with the troops that were being supplied on the Andrivka bridgehead that were coming in from Mykolaiv and from Brezhnev that were getting constant supplies. And so now they were linked together and they could work more cohesively to force the Russians to retreat even further inland. And so for the next month or so, now going into October, we did not see many changes. Surovikin was able to hold the line after having to retreat to a better position tactically. And so eventually, on October 8th, Surovikin is made in charge of the entire special military operation. And upon taking this position, he said that he would have to make very, quote, difficult decisions. And so at the time, there was a lot of speculation as to what this would mean. We didn't actually know if that would mean some sort of like provocation with some sort of nuclear weapon or something. That was something that was thrown out there, big rumor. But it turns out what he meant was actually just withdrawing from Kherson. And that would be undoubtedly a very difficult decision for the Russians because it would just look horribly after it was annexed. Because it was annexed, I think it was September 30th, the Kherson Oblast. And in addition, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk, all of those oblasts were annexed and are supposed to officially be a part of Russia. And so by withdrawing from the capital of one of their oblasts, it really does not look good. And especially given the fact that it's in the Russian constitution now. But either way, he had this view that the tactical decisions had to be made if it meant preservation of troops' lives and equipment and all of that. And so what I think happened is that the second that he got into the leader of the special military operation, he began to scale down the Russian grouping over here, sending them across the river very gradually, trying to hold back any sort of Ukrainian breakthroughs during that time by sending in probably conscripts that had not been trained that well just to hold the line. Meanwhile, the Russians, they used their drones and their aircraft to hold on and prevent further Ukrainian artillery systems, our air defense systems from being installed in this area. And so, yeah, that was pretty successful. It was able to keep the Ukrainians at bay for about a month. But as we went into November, really the situation became untenable, and Struvikin, he had always seen the writing on the wall, and by now the evacuation has been announced of all the civilians. And so the Russian, or so-called Russian civilians, they had been evacuated. So it was finally time to actually withdraw. And so this was probably something that was planned for a very long time. And so the reason why Surovikin wanted this to happen is because there are only two ways to actually supply the grouping in Kherson. So I'm going to zoom in on that. First one is the Antonovsky Bridge, of course, which has been targeted by HIMARS for months upon months on end. And it's still standing, although it does have some damage. You do have the road and the rail line over here. And so both of those are important to supplying the Russian grouping. Then you also have the Novakakovka Dam, where you have a path over here. It looks like there's also a rail line over here and a road as well. And so that is also done to supply heavy equipment and reinforcements to the front line. And also, these were the only two paths that could be used to supply equipment and supplies for the civilians, which is a part of why they were also evacuated earlier. And so the HIMARS, they really rained down heavy fire on these areas, and both of the bridges had been damaged at some points. So really the only other option was either to build a pontoon bridge, which was something that the Russians did build next to the Antonovsky Bridge, but even that was targeted in HIMARS attacks. And so it's not really sustainable. Ferries aren't sustainable either. They could be targeted, they could be hit, and even if they wouldn't be, it would just be much slower to supply a lot of equipment. And so it is true that a lot of the ferries could not be hit by HIMARS because really it's a GPS system. It can't like track moving objects. But either way, the situation was not tenable in terms of supplies. And just to put it frankly, the Russian contingent was two bridges away from being completely isolated, completely surrounded. And that was certainly a possibility because after months of shelling, eventually could have happened where both of the bridges would have been incapacitated and the logistical situation could have been incredibly dire. And so this is probably the best decision that the Russians could have made given the situation. Not to take away from Ukraine's success, a lot of props have to be given to the Ukrainians for, first of all, being able to stop the Russian advances in Mykolaiv, Kryvyi Rih, Vozdeshensk in the first place, and then actually being able to apply pressure onto the Russians, forcing them to withdraw more and more until eventually they realized that the only option they had left is to withdraw across the river. And so now I want to look forward and see what could happen in the future. The Russians have not actually left all of the right bank of the river. You still have some Russians in Kherson city itself. You probably have some in Chornobaivka, although I would say those numbers are incredibly low. Same thing with Bilozerka. And then you probably have some in some of these towns that are just on the coast: Antonivka, Sadove, Ivanivka, Kozatske, which is probably you have some Russian troops over there because it does connect to Novakakovka. And then also, importantly, Berislav, you do have some important Russian barracks set up over here. You have the 10th Spetsnaz Brigade. They were always situated in this area. And so they have not actually left this area yet. And so there is some speculation that maybe the Russians will not fully withdraw from the river, across the river, even though yesterday Surovikin announced the withdrawal across the river and it was approved by Shwigu. We don't actually know what will happen on the ground. There is the possibility that the Russians have planned and are now trying to go through with this idea that they can shorten the front line significantly just around the key cities. Maybe they don't even use Berislav. Maybe they also abandon Berislav. Maybe it's only Kherson. The problem with this is that they'd have only one way to supply their grouping, and that would be the Antonovsky Bridge. And it would be heavily shelled, not only by HIMARS, but like any other sort of artillery system would be within the range of shelling the Antonovsky Bridge. And so any sort of strategy like this would be incredibly untenable, even if the Russians would be able to hide in residential blocks. That would certainly slow the Ukrainians down. But at that point, I don't even think they'd try to enter the city. They would just wait on the outside until the Russians died or suffered from a lack of supplies due to the logistical situation. And then they would be forced to surrender out of their own volition, sort of like the what happened with the surrounding of Mariupol. Now, on to the more likely scenario that we will see. Because Russia has three lines of defense. The first one is on the Dnipro River itself. And so this line totally disregards the Kinburn Spit, which is over here, you can see. That will be totally disregarded. It's basically Russia's giving it up because their defensive lines are centered around this area over here, connecting with the Dnipro River, and then from there going along the coast to key cities like Novokakhovka and then Kakovka itself. And yeah, it's just basically on the coast. You have a lot of trench lines that were set up over here. You have a lot of dugouts for vehicles that were built. Pillboxes were actually moved in. Portable pillboxes, interestingly. I don't know how effective those would be, but a lot of those were mass produced and then just moved into the areas on the river. We actually have a geolocation for one of them over here that you can look at. Not this one. It was there was one that I added in, I think, in Kakovka of Russian fortifications. And there was also a lot of Russian fortifications being built specifically around the Tendrivska Gulf, which is pretty interesting. It does indicate that the Russians are expecting some sort of amphibious assault. I would not put it past the Ukrainians to actually go through with this because they can try to strike the Russians from the flanks. So you could have an amphibious assault from Ochakiv. Horoyske would be taken, and then from there they could apply pressure to the Russian defensive line. And so, really, this is what Russia's banking on. But if this line were to fail, they do have two other lines, which are actually probably better because they are south of the floodplains. And these floodplains are very difficult to defend, especially if there's a lot of artillery barrages coming in from the Ukrainians, a lot of mortars, sniper fire, all of that. It's very difficult to hold on to these floodplains, especially if there were to be an amphibious assault. It would be much smarter to go to the higher elevation area, which is around the Oloksy Sands National Park. Towns like Holy Pristan, Sahi, Novokakhovka, that might also have to be withdrawn from. Something very interesting is who would actually control the dam if the dividing line between the Russians and the Ukrainians was the Dnipro River. Um, there are potential scenarios that it would be blown up by either side, and that would just put a wrench in all of the different plans that I'm talking about for the Russians. But anyway, the second line of defense, it would really start around this town over here. I'm going to zoom in on it. It starts around this road over here from Vasilivka to Sofivka. And from there, it connects to the main road that is south of Kakovka. And from there, it follows this path. I'm going to go over it in red so everyone can see. It goes like this. And then from there, it goes just north of the national park. It's not actually on the main floodplains, but it is pretty close to them. So there is a lot of satellite imagery showing how this is one of the main Russian lines. Crosses through Hola Pristan, and in terms of where it ends, it really ends around the town of Ivanivka over here. And so you have this entire line over here. This area is very open in terms of its terrain. And so you could see potentially some sort of mechanized breakthrough. But first, there would have to be a crossing of a body of water. And so that's why Russia is banking on being able to hold on this entire line. But even if this line fails, they do have a backup line, the third line, which is Petropavlivka, which is a town around over here. It is sort of a junction between a lot of the different roads in this left bank of Kherson. And so the line goes in. It's very similar to the second line, but it actually crosses through the national park, using it to their advantage. And then it goes through this very minor road over here, crossing through some minor settlements just to the south of a lot of these sand patches. I'm not sure how easy it would be to cross over this entire area. There's really not a lot of cover in this area, and it connects to Chulakivka, and then from there it ends around here. Very very close to a lot of these towns on the southern coast of Kherson, which is very interesting. And so that also means that Russia might be willing to give it up in the future if Ukraine is able to cross the river and still be able to maintain a cohesive front line. But here's the problem with all this. The more and more Russia is pushed back, they don't have a finite and infinite amount of space. They will eventually be pushed back to Crimea at this current rate. And so the best course of action, I believe, for the Ukrainians in order to continue the momentum is actually to just launch a concurrent attack from Zaporizhia, because now the Russians have already set up three lines of defense south of the river, not to mention whatever forces they have in Kherson. And so you have these three lines of defense over here, but we don't actually know how many Russian troops are situated in Vasilivka, Tokmak, Melitopol, this entire area. There's a possibility that it is significantly undermanned. And we've seen this story play out many times already. We saw it play out in Kharkov. We saw it play out in northern Kherson. We saw it play out right now. Always Ukrainians are probing, finding these sort of weak points in the Russian line. And so they've been doing that for weeks upon weeks now in Zaporizhia. And I don't know if they've had success yet. It has really been going on around the Orikhiv region, and you do have a lot of National Guards units. You have a lot of NATO trained, specifically British trained units that are stationed in the city of Zaporizhia. And so these people, they have very good combat experience. And given the relatively good terrain in the Zaporizhia area, especially where the front line is now situated, it is possible that there could be some sort of mechanized breakthrough. And that's what Ukraine is really best at. We've seen them do it many times, especially in Kherson. It's where the terrain is really suitable for that. Those sort of mechanized breakthroughs are not as suitable in a place like Donetsk, but it could work in Zaporizhia. And if they're able to break through into Tokmak, you will see the dominoes start to fall. You can see Melitopol being threatened. You can see Enerhadar being threatened, because from there you can have a pincer operation to encircle Enerhadar and take back the nuclear power plant, which would be a huge win for Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And it would just be horrible for Russia's land bridge in general, because from there they would be very close to reaching the Sea of Azov again and actually taking these towns on the coast like Berdyansk, like Primorsk, all these different towns over here. And by separating these two groupings, it will be much more difficult to coordinate the special military operation, especially given issues with the Kerch Bridge. Obviously, it's being repaired now, but it will be closer. It will be within range of HIMARS, I believe, especially if the Ukrainians take Berdyansk. Then from there, they can fire onto the Kerch Bridge. And so there will be a very huge issue for whatever troops remain in the remaining parts of Kherson, whatever Russian troops are still located here. They would have to retreat into Crimea, and in Crimea, you already have a lot of trenches being built, old trenches being repurposed. I'm not saying this will all happen at all or it will happen quickly. This is just a long term strategy for the Ukrainians. And what I think I would do specifically if I was Zelensky right now, but that's probably their mode of thinking. Meanwhile, the Russians, they want to preserve the line, hold it at a pretty stable area until the reserves come in, until they're fully trained. Everyone's already mobilized, and so they can be sent pretty quickly to the front line, absorbed into the existing units. And from there, maybe there could be some sort of offensive operation launched by the Russians in the winter. And so we'd have to look out for where that would happen. Maybe that would happen in Zaporizhia. I don't know. Maybe they tried to attack there before the Ukrainians tried to break through. That's all speculation. But looking at the situation in Kherson again, I want to talk about some of the rumors that have been flying around. And so obviously take this with a grain of salt. But there has been a lot of talk about the specific number of Russian troops that are stationed in Kherson at the moment. I saw Ukrainian sources, they were saying 20,000, but I think this is highly suspect because we've seen the evacuation go on for so long. Of course, it was under the guise of civilian evacuation, but a lot of people have been alleging that it included a lot of military troops, including the elite units. And so there is a good chance that a lot of those elite units have already left and that are already on the left bank of the Dnieper River. And whatever troops are left to hold the line are more so these conscripts. And so I highly doubt that there are that many troops left that could like potentially surrender to the Ukrainians. But what the Ukrainian sources are saying is that really it's impossible for them to organize a good escape across the river now, because Ukrainians are firing upon their positions. They have these DRG units that are occupying checkpoints along the river, and that's stopping a coordinated retreat. but this is really unconfirmed for now. And the best information we have is just that there's been heavy artillery duels between the Russians and the Ukrainians along the river, and that there have been attempts by the HIMARS, I think, or some other MLRS system to damage the Antonovsky Bridge. We don't know if it was hit, but we did hear from Novakakovka, from the Russian sources, that there were 18 missiles fired, and they say that all of them were intercepted. Take it with a grain of salt, obviously, but that is what the Russians are alleging. The Russians are also pushing back on a lot of the allegations that the Russian troops have to abandon all their heavy equipment and all their small arms and just swim across the river. They're saying that the situation has been relatively quiet and that they are still in control of these key areas and that they're able to retreat in a orderly manner. And so there's no way to know what's actually happening in this regard. It's the fog of war, and so we'll only get the specific amount of information later on. But I do hope that this video is useful in sort of getting some background knowledge about the situation in Kherson and what could potentially happen there later on. And so I will go back to doing the summaries of the front lines tomorrow. And from then on, obviously, we'll get into the other fronts. But that's all I have for today. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you later.